It is a warm night in the American South. The cicadas hum. The moonlight settles over endless fields of cotton, and the sound of chains rattles faintly in the distance. On one of Georgia's plantations in 1847, the enslaved whisper among themselves. They whisper about something darker than the lash of the overseer, darker than the endless days under the sun. They whisper about the breeding farms. To most outsiders, the plantation was a place of hard labor and wealth, a world where cotton and tobacco grew tall, and the white planter class grew richer with every bale that left the docks. But to those enslaved, the plantation was a prison, and inside that prison was a secret so disturbing that even many Southerners refused to speak of it. The secret was this: enslaved men and women were not only forced to work, they were also forced to reproduce. Their very bodies were turned into tools of profit. It was whispered that some plantations treated human reproduction like livestock breeding. Strong young men were paired with women, not for love, not for family, but for the market. A child born on a plantation was not seen as a son or daughter. That child was inventory, an investment, another body to be sold or worked for decades to come. This was the hidden horror of the Old South. When we think of slavery, most imagine fields, overseers, and brutal punishments. But behind closed doors, another form of cruelty thrived. The enslaved were reduced not only to laborers, but to breeders. Their humanity stripped away, their dignity destroyed. They were forced into acts of intimacy that were anything but their own. Even today, historians debate just how widespread these practices were. Some argue that so-called slave-breeding farms were exaggerated, rumors spread by abolitionists to stir outrage. Others, however, point to chilling evidence: sales records, plantation journals, testimonies from former slaves that reveal a pattern too calculated to ignore. The truth lies somewhere in between. While not every plantation operated like a breeding farm, enough of them did. And where it existed, it left behind scars too deep to ever fully heal. Imagine this: a woman, perhaps only 16 years old, taken from her family and placed in a cabin with a man she barely knew. There was no romance, no choice. Her owner wanted children, and she had no say in the matter. Every child she bore was born into bondage, a newborn already carrying the weight of chains. Some men, labeled as studs, were forced into repeated couplings. Their bodies treated like stallions meant only for reproduction. They too carried the shame, the loss of control, the awareness that their children would never be free. And above it all stood the plantation owners and their families. For them, these practices were business, cold, calculating, and hidden beneath the surface of Southern gentility. But the enslaved spoke of it. Quietly, in hushed tones, they told stories of women forced to bear child after child, of families broken before they even began, of lives reduced to numbers on a ledger. The reality of these whispers was terrifying enough, but what made it worse was the hunger driving it all. Because by the early 1800s, the American South faced a crisis. In 1808, the United States officially banned the international importation of enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was cut off. For plantation owners, this meant one thing: they could no longer simply buy boatloads of enslaved men and women fresh from Africa. Yet the demand for labor was growing. Cotton was booming, tobacco still thrived, and sugar plantations thrived further south. The South needed more enslaved workers, but with no imports, where would they come from? The answer was horrifying in its simplicity: they would be bred. This economic pressure gave rise to a new system, one that relied not only on whips and chains, but on the exploitation of women's wombs. Every child born was profit. Every pregnancy was a business venture. The bodies of enslaved men and women became the raw material for the Southern economy, so the whispers grew louder. Stories of certain plantations, certain families where breeding was encouraged, even orchestrated, where young women were pushed to have as many children as possible, where owners manipulated pairings and sometimes crossed lines so vile that even their own blood was not off limits. The plantation was no longer just a place of forced labor. It was a factory of life and death and profit. This was the world hidden behind the fences and hedges, behind the white-pillared houses that symbolized Southern pride. And though many tried to keep it secret, the truth had a way of seeping out through the voices of the enslaved, through the records left behind, and through the trauma that would echo across generations. The Old South was not just built on cotton, it was built on bodies, and in the darkest corners of its plantations, reproduction itself became a weapon. But behind the ledgers and the prophets, there were human beings. Women who cried as their children were taken from them. Men who felt the crushing weight of being forced into fatherhood without freedom. Children who never knew what it meant to be safe in their mother's arms. This is where our story begins, with the whispered horror of breeding farms, a chapter so disturbing that it was almost erased from memory. Yet, to understand why this happened and how it became such a calculated system, we must look deeper into the economics, the desperation, and the cold calculations that made human reproduction a business in itself. Because this was not just cruelty. It was strategy, and it changed the course of slavery in America forever. By the early 1800s, the United States was at a turning point. Cotton was rising, demand was exploding, and the South needed more enslaved labor than ever before. But with the 1808 ban on importing Africans, the transatlantic slave trade came to an end. For plantation owners, this was a crisis. Without a fresh supply of enslaved workers, how could they keep their fields running? How could they keep the money flowing? The answer was as chilling as it was profitable. They would turn reproduction into a business. In the eyes of the Southern elite, every enslaved woman became a womb of profit, every enslaved man a potential stud. Children were no longer just human lives, they were financial assets. And with that shift, the very idea of breeding enslaved people took hold. Owners began to calculate birth rates the way they calculated crop yields. They looked at enslaved women not only for how well they could pick cotton, but for how many children they could bear. Records from plantations revealed chilling entries, notes about prime breeding women, inventories that listed the number of children expected, and price evaluations for infants who had barely opened their eyes. A single enslaved child could fetch hundreds of dollars at auction, sometimes as much as $500 or more. Adjusted for today, that's the equivalent of more than $15,000. Multiply that by dozens of children over years, and the profits soared. Suddenly, the womb became an economic engine. This system created a perverse incentive. Enslaved women were often forced into repeated pregnancies, their bodies broken under the strain of childbirth after childbirth. For the owners, it was simple math. The more children born, the more money made. And since the children inherited their mother's enslaved status, every new birth expanded the plantation's labor force without a single purchase from outside. But the business didn't stop at home. Entire regions of the South became suppliers of enslaved people. States like Virginia and Maryland, with declining soil quality, found themselves producing more enslaved children than they could use. Instead of crops, they began to sell people. Families were broken apart as children were shipped south to booming cotton states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. It became known darkly as the slave breeding industry. A cruel irony unfolded. While abolitionists in the North condemned the foreign slave trade as barbaric, Southern planters simply turned inward, growing their own supply of enslaved labor. It was a domestic pipeline of human lives hidden behind the polished facades of Southern plantations. The auctions told the story best. Enslaved infants were sold with their mothers, sometimes only months old. Young boys and girls were evaluated not by their laughter or their innocence, but by their growth potential. Teenage girls were particularly prized, not for their work, but for their ability to produce children for decades to come. The ledgers are difficult to read even today. Notations like breeding wench, likely girl, and prime stock reveal how little humanity remained in the eyes of the traders. These weren't people anymore. They were reduced to livestock terms, commodified until all traces of personhood were erased. Behind every sale, there was a story of grief. Mothers torn from children, Fathers powerless to protect their families. Young women forced into pregnancies they never asked for. And yet in the cold arithmetic of the slave market, this grief meant nothing. Money was the only language that mattered. The business of human breeding was not an official institution with signboards and factories. It was something far more insidious, a system woven into everyday plantation life, a hidden economy where the currency was flesh and blood. Some plantation owners bragged about the increase of their enslaved population, recording the number of babies born each year as a measure of success. Others quietly arranged pairings, forcing certain men and women together with the expectation of children. In the darkest cases, owners themselves or their sons took matters into their own hands, fathering children with enslaved women under the guise of ownership. For the enslaved, it meant that their bodies were never their own. Work, sleep, even reproduction, everything was dictated by someone else. The idea of love, family, or choice became almost impossible under such conditions. Still, the business thrived. By the 1830s and 1840s, the domestic slave trade was booming, with thousands of enslaved people sold each year from the Upper South to the Deep South. Many of those sold were children, born into bondage not by accident, but by design. It was a self-sustaining cycle. Women gave birth, children were sold, and the profits encouraged more forced pregnancies. The system fed itself, growing stronger with each generation, and all the while the plantations prospered. The cotton industry exploded, America's economy soared, and the wealth of the South was built upon the broken families and stolen futures of the enslaved. But behind these numbers, behind the ledgers and the sales, were real people. People who cried out in pain, who mourned the loss of their children, who struggled to hold on to scraps of dignity in a world that denied their humanity. The business of human breeding was not just an economic system. It was a moral catastrophe, a deliberate choice to reduce people to property and profit. And yet, this system could not have existed without the silent complicity of those who ran it, the masters and mistresses of the plantations, who enforced, encouraged, and sometimes even expanded these practices. To understand the full horror of breeding farms, we must look not only at the numbers, but at the people behind them, the owners who orchestrated it, and the women who carried its heaviest burden. If the business of human breeding was the machine, then enslaved women were its unwilling gears. They carried the heaviest burden, not only of labor in the fields, but of forced pregnancies that turned their very bodies into tools of profit. Imagine being a young woman, barely into your teenage years. You are sold at auction, your body examined by strangers. Not only your arms and legs, not only your teeth and back, but your hips, your waist, your womb. Buyers whisper to one another, not about your personality, not about your hopes, but about how many children you might produce. For enslaved women, this was not motherhood. This was captivity of the flesh. Once on the plantation, the nightmare began in earnest. Some women were assigned to men chosen by the owner. These unions were not marriages, not families, but arrangements of convenience dictated by economics. The overseer, or sometimes the mistress of the house, would encourage certain pairings, pushing men and women together like livestock, with the expectation that a child would follow. Other women faced a far crueler fate. Their pregnancies came not from pairings, but from assault. Plantation owners, their sons, overseers, and other white men forced themselves upon enslaved women with impunity. The law offered no protection. The woman's voice, her protest, meant nothing. Her body was not her own. It was the property of another. For many enslaved women, every pregnancy was a source of dread. The act of bringing life into the world should have been sacred, but in slavery it became a curse, because every child born was born into chains. Every child represented another link in the system that bound them all. Some women were forced into childbirth again and again, their bodies weakened by the strain of constant pregnancies, their spirits broken by the knowledge that their children were not theirs to keep. Mothers often watched their babies taken from them, sold to another plantation, given away as gifts, or sent to the auction block while still toddlers. To give birth meant to risk heartbreak, to live in constant fear that the tiny life you cradled in your arms would be ripped away. This cycle created what one historian called a living nightmare. A nightmare where joy was always shadowed by loss, and where a woman's most intimate experiences were controlled by others. The cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological. Many women lived in terror of pregnancy. Others tried desperately to avoid it. Some used herbs and traditional remedies, passed down in secret, to prevent conception or to end unwanted pregnancies. These quiet acts of resistance were dangerous, but they were one of the few ways women could reclaim some control over their own bodies. But not all attempts succeeded. Many women still gave birth, and with each birth came the fear of separation. Some mothers chose to distance themselves emotionally from their children, knowing the pain of loss would come sooner or later. Others held on fiercely, only to be broken when the inevitable sale arrived. The voices of those who lived through it echo faintly in the records left behind. Former enslaved women, interviewed decades later during the 1930s WPA narratives, described lives shaped by fear and exploitation. They spoke of pregnancies forced upon them, of owners who viewed them as breeding stock, of children stolen before they could even remember their mothers' faces. One woman, recalling her youth, said, "I was made to have child after child. I didn't want to, but the master said I must. Every time I looked at them babies, I knew they weren't mine to keep." Another remembered how the plantation mistress would watch her pregnancies carefully, counting her children as though they were calves born on a farm. "She said I was a good breeder," the woman recalled bitterly, "like I was a horse or a cow." The humiliation was crushing. Women who might have dreamed of love, of family, of dignity, found themselves reduced to wombs for hire. Their value measured not by their humanity, but by the children they could produce. And yet, within this nightmare there was resilience. Some women resisted quietly, hiding pregnancies, delaying births, or secretly taking steps to avoid conception. Others clung fiercely to their children, protecting them however they could, even when the odds were hopeless. But no matter how hard they fought, the power imbalance was too great. The system was designed to strip away their choices, their rights, their very sense of self. For enslaved women, the nightmare was not only the abuse they endured, it was the knowledge that their own children, flesh of their flesh, would inherit the same fate. A legacy of chains passed down from mother to child, generation after generation. This was the human cost of the breeding system. Beyond ledgers and profits, beyond the cold arithmetic of the slave trade, lay a world of anguish carried on the backs of women. They were the ones who bore the weight, literally and figuratively, of slavery's cruelest secret. Their pain was the foundation of the plantation economy. Their bodies turned into factories of wealth. And while their voices were often silenced in their own time, their suffering speaks volumes through history. To truly understand the nightmare of slave breeding, we must look not only at the victims, but at those who orchestrated it, the masters and mistresses of the plantations, who profited from the pain and made choices that turned families into commodities. Behind every ledger, every auction, every forced birth, there stood men and women who engineered the system. The masters and mistresses of the Old South were not just passive participants in slavery. They were active architects of the breeding machine. For the master, the logic was simple. His wealth was tied to the number of enslaved people he owned. Cotton fields, tobacco crops, sugar plantations, they all demanded labor. And when the foreign slave trade ended, he looked inward, turning his gaze toward the wombs of enslaved women. Many plantation owners began to pride themselves not just on their crop yields, but on the increase of their enslaved population. In diaries and account books, they recorded births as though they were seasonal harvests. A man might boast that his plantation grew by 10 children in a year, a sign not of joy but of profit. But the master's role was not always distant. Some were directly involved in orchestrating couplings, pairing strong young men with women of childbearing age, pressuring them into unions designed for maximum fertility. Others were far darker still, forcing themselves upon enslaved women, fathering children who were born into bondage, children they would often deny. These masters wielded absolute power. There was no law to restrain them, no social consequence too severe to fear. The enslaved had no voice in court, no protection against assault. A white man could do as he pleased, and the system protected him. Yet the story does not end with men alone. The mistresses, the wives of plantation owners, were also complicit. To the outside world, the southern mistress embodied refinement and piety. She was seen as the moral center of the household, the keeper of Christian values. But behind closed doors, her role was more complex and often more sinister. Some mistresses turned a blind eye to the breeding practices of their husbands. Others actively encouraged them. For these women, enslaved children meant wealth and security. A fertile plantation ensured social status, provided dowries for their daughters, and safeguarded their own financial stability should they be widowed. Mistresses were not merely bystanders. In many households, they managed the enslaved women directly. They monitored pregnancies, tracked births, and calculated the financial benefit of each child. They judged enslaved women not only on their labor but on their ability to reproduce. There are chilling accounts of mistresses praising women for being good breeders or scolding them for not bearing enough children. Some treated childbirth almost as a contest, measuring their own fertility against that of the enslaved. But the darkest stories are those where the boundaries of morality collapsed entirely. Whispers tell of mothers who, desperate to expand their wealth, encouraged their own sons to father children with enslaved women. Rumors of incest, of twisted family arrangements, circulated quietly among the enslaved. Whether whispered in truth or as dark rumor, such tales reveal the atmosphere of depravity that surrounded these plantations. An atmosphere where the normal rules of morality no longer applied, because the system itself was immoral at its core. The mistresses also carried their own cruelty. Enslaved women who bore the children of masters often became the targets of jealousy and rage. Plantation mistresses, unable to confront their husbands, would instead lash out at the women, punishing them, selling their children, or subjecting them to harsher treatment. One enslaved woman, recalling her past in an interview decades later, said, "The mistress hated us. She knew her husband came to our cabins at night and she blamed us for it. She said we were temptresses, but how could we tempt a man who owned us?" It was a bitter cycle. The master violated, the mistress punished, and the enslaved woman bore the consequences of both. The plantation household thus became a theater of hypocrisy. The same families who read the Bible at breakfast and preached morality in church used the bodies of enslaved people as their personal property. Their wealth was built on cruelty, their reputations protected by silence. And when the children of these forced unions were born, often bearing the unmistakable features of the master or his sons, the hypocrisy grew unbearable. Some of these children were raised in the slave quarters, treated no differently from others, despite sharing the blood of the very man who claimed to own them. Others were sold off quickly, shipped away to erase the evidence of their origin. The masters and mistresses could reshape reality however they wished. They denied paternity, justified cruelty, and cloaked exploitation in the language of necessity. They told themselves that breeding was simply business, that the increase of the enslaved population was natural, inevitable, even ordained by God. But beneath these justifications lay a chilling truth. The system depended on the deliberate violation of human dignity. And those who enforced it, the so-called pillars of Southern society, were willing participants. The plantation elite presented themselves as civilized, cultured, and refined. Yet behind their grand columns and polished silver, they presided over a system that reduced people to flesh and profit, that turned intimacy into commerce, and that blurred even the most sacred boundaries of family. This is the reality of the masters and mistresses, the architects of the breeding system, whose choices and silences made it possible. But to fully grasp the scope of this horror, we must move beyond individuals and look at the broader geography, because breeding farms were not confined to a single plantation. They spread across the South, woven into the very fabric of slavery. By the mid-19th century, whispers had grown into a grim reality. Breeding was no longer confined to the hidden corners of individual plantations. Across the South, there emerged entire regions known for their grim specialization, the breeding of enslaved human beings. Virginia and Maryland stood at the heart of this system. Once dominant in tobacco, their soils had been exhausted, their crops no longer profitable. But their enslaved populations remained, and so planters in these states found a new market, not in tobacco leaves, but in the bodies of men, women, and children. Virginia became known as a slave-breeding state, a supplier to the booming cotton and sugar plantations further south. Young men and women were raised not for freedom, not for their own futures, but to be sold southward like cattle. The birth of a child was counted not as a moment of joy, but as a unit of stock, destined for auction. From Richmond to Baltimore, markets swelled with the sale of enslaved families. Slave traders traveled dusty roads with coffles of chained men, women, and children, their numbers replenished by the deliberate increase of plantations designed for this purpose. In Georgia and South Carolina, the demand was insatiable. Cotton was king, and each new acre required more hands to work the fields. Enslaved people purchased from Virginia's breeding farms were shipped down in droves, sold at auctions that treated them as nothing more than prime labor stock. The very language of the trade reflected the horror. Men deemed physically strong were labeled studs. These men were forced to impregnate multiple women, sometimes dozens, their worth measured by the number of children they produced. There was no intimacy, no choice, only coercion. They were paraded, inspected, and commanded, reduced to breeding machines in service of profit. For the women, the nightmare was endless. Selected for fertility, they were paired, pressured, and pushed to bear child after child. Some gave birth to 10, 12, even 15 children across their lifetimes, many of whom were torn away and sold before they reached adolescence. Their bodies bore the marks of forced reproduction, their spirits scarred by the loss of every child who disappeared down the river or across the auction block. Plantation ledgers recorded these births meticulously. One account from Virginia coldly noted, "Increase 5 children born this year. Estimated value, $3,000. Such entries read less like human records and more like inventories of livestock. Each child's future was determined before they could walk, their worth calculated in dollars rather than dreams. Travelers who passed through the South sometimes noticed the strange imbalance. Counties where enslaved populations grew faster than seemed natural, where the numbers told a hidden story of deliberate breeding. Abolitionists seized upon these observations, writing pamphlets that accused the South of running human stud farms. Though Southern defenders denied the existence of such institutions, the patterns were undeniable. The horror was not just in the numbers, but in the families destroyed. Children born in Virginia were often shipped to Mississippi or Louisiana before their mothers could even wean them. Brothers and sisters were torn apart, scattered across states, their names erased and replaced with new identities by traders. One former enslaved man, recalling his youth in a WPA interview decades later, described watching wagon after wagon of children leave his plantation. They was just babies, he said, and they cried for their mamas. But they was sold quick. Master said the farm was good that year. In places like Richmond's Shockoe Bottom, one of the largest slave markets in America, these children became commodities. Traders lined them up for inspection, boasting of their strong bloodlines, their capacity for labor, their docility. Behind the polished language was a system designed to strip away every last shred of humanity. And yet, even as this trade expanded, it remained cloaked in silence. Plantation owners rarely admitted openly to breeding practices. Publicly, they spoke of natural increase. Privately, they managed pairings, rewarded prolific mothers, and punished women who resisted. The breeding farms existed in the shadowlands of slavery, never officially named, but always present, always known. The cruelty was not just economic, it was psychological. Enslaved men forced into the role of studs often carried deep shame, knowing their children would be sold away, never allowed to call them father. Enslaved women endured pregnancies that were not their own choice, bringing life into a world that would immediately strip it away. Children grew up watching siblings vanish, never knowing if they were alive or dead. Generations were broken apart deliberately, systematically for profit. These breeding farms of the South were not anomalies. They were not a few bad plantations hidden in remote corners. They were part of the machinery of slavery itself, a machinery so vast, so cruel, that it reshaped the very demographics of America. And at the center of this machinery were the human lives it consumed. Men, women, and children reduced to numbers in a ledger, sold as commodities, bred as livestock, and discarded when their bodies broke under the weight of exploitation. This was the geography of human breeding. Virginia's farms supplying the Deep South, Georgia's cotton empire devouring fresh bodies, South Carolina's traders feeding the hunger for labor. A network of cruelty stretched across the South, each state complicit in a trade that fed upon human flesh. And for the families caught in its grasp, the cost was measured not in dollars but in heartbreak. The true cost of the breeding farms cannot be measured in numbers or in ledgers filled with births and sales. The true cost was human, etched into the broken families left behind. For every child born into slavery, there was a mother who feared the day that child would be taken from her arms. For every father forced into the role of a stud, there was the crushing knowledge that his children would grow up calling another man master. On plantations across the South, families were deliberately fractured as a matter of business. Children were assets to be sold at the highest price. A baby's first cry might just as easily mark the beginning of a countdown to the auction block. Mothers held their infants knowing that each year brought them closer to separation. One former enslaved woman recalled in her WPA interview how she had borne 12 children but had only seen one of them live beside her into adulthood. 11 were sold away before they could even form lasting memories of her face. She remembered their names, their birthdays, their small details, but she had no idea where they had gone or whether they had survived. Her words were heavy with grief. They took them one by one. I never even knew where they was carried. This was not an accident. It was design. Traders timed sales with market demand, ripping families apart when buyers were willing to pay the most. Young boys were prized for their labor, young girls for both work and reproduction. Infants too small for labor were sometimes sold alongside their mothers, but just as often they were sold separately, parceled out like items in a shop. The destruction of kinship was deliberate. Enslaved people were denied legal marriages. Their unions had no protection under the law. A man and woman could pledge themselves to each other, raise children together, and build a fragile sense of family. But in the eyes of the plantation system, they were nothing more than property. Their bonds erased with the stroke of a pen at the auction block. Children grew up in constant fear of being sold away. They clung to their mothers' skirts when traders arrived, begging not to be taken. Parents tried to comfort them, but they knew the truth. Their love could not protect their children from the economy of slavery. Some mothers took desperate measures. There are stories, passed down through whispers, of women who poisoned their own children rather than see them dragged away. Others hid their children in swamps or sent them to relatives on neighboring plantations, praying they would not be found. Resistance was born from love, but too often it was crushed by the relentless machinery of profit. Fathers, too, carried wounds. Those forced into roles as breeders often watched as their children were taken without even an acknowledgement of their parenthood. A man could father dozens of children, yet not be allowed to raise a single one. His offspring were counted as part of the master's wealth, not his family. The very act of fatherhood was stripped of meaning, leaving only guilt and grief. This tearing apart of families left psychological scars that ran deep. Enslaved people learned to steel themselves against attachment, to harden their hearts as protection. Love became dangerous when the one you loved could be gone tomorrow. Yet even in the face of this, they still loved. They still formed families. And that act of defiance, of choosing to love in a world designed to rip love apart, was perhaps the greatest resistance of all. In the voices of survivors recorded long after emancipation, the trauma is still raw. One man described the sight of his little sister being sold. She cried and held onto Mama's dress. They tore her loose and took her away. I never saw her again. He was in his 80s when he told this story, but he wept as though it had happened yesterday. The breeding farms did more than produce labor. They produced loss. Each child sold southward left behind a hole that could never be filled. Each family broken was a wound passed from one generation to the next. Enslaved communities held funerals for the living, mourning children and parents as though they had died, because in truth, they had been erased from their lives forever, and this destruction was profitable. The pain of families became the wealth of traders, planters, and auctioneers. Every broken bond was another dollar gained in the southern economy, but not every family submitted quietly. Some ran together or apart, risking death to stay united. Some mothers defied breeding orders, refusing to conceive more children. Others clung fiercely to their children, fighting traders until they were beaten down. These small acts of resistance were desperate attempts to hold on to the most basic human right, the right to love and remain with your family. The breeding farms were not just about creating laborers. They were about breaking people, reducing them to property by severing the most sacred bonds of human life. By tearing children from mothers, fathers from children, siblings from one another, the system sought to erase identity itself. And yet, the memory of family endured. Even in the ruins, enslaved people carried stories of their lost loved ones. They whispered names, sang songs, and passed down fragments of memory, refusing to let the system erase those connections entirely. The families torn apart by breeding farms remind us that slavery was not only an institution of labor, it was an institution of grief. Its victims were not just chained in the fields, but bound by the sorrow of separation, a sorrow that no emancipation could fully heal. For every act of control the slave system imposed, there was an answer, quiet, hidden, and dangerous. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance, beaten down by labor and fear, yet they found ways to resist. In the face of breeding farms designed to strip them of choice, they clung to their humanity and fought back in ways both small and profound. Some resisted with their bodies. Women, forced into endless pregnancies, sometimes sought ways to prevent conception. They used herbal remedies whispered about in secret, passed from mother to daughter. Cottonroot, pennyroyal, and other plants became weapons of survival. These remedies were dangerous, sometimes deadly, but they represented a desperate grasp at control. To deny the master another child was, in its own way, an act of rebellion. Others went further. There were women who risked everything by inducing abortions, choosing to prevent their children from being born into chains. These decisions carried unimaginable weight, driven not by selfishness, but by love. The heartbreaking determination that it was better for a child never to live than to live only as property. Men, too, resisted the role forced upon them. Those chosen as studs sometimes refused to cooperate, risking brutal punishment. Some deliberately failed to impregnate women, using the only power they had over their bodies to defy their masters. Such acts were dangerous and often discovered, but they spoke to a quiet rebellion, a refusal to accept the role of livestock. Flight was another form of resistance. Families risked everything to escape together. Parents with children crept into the night, guided by whispers of the North Star. They crossed swamps, forests, and rivers, chased by hounds and armed patrols, driven by the single hope of staying together. Many were caught, punished, or killed, but some made it. Their names and stories live on in fragments, testaments to the courage it took to defy an entire system. Resistance also lived in the spirit. Even when they could not control their bodies or their fates, enslaved people kept their culture alive. They told stories that carried secret lessons, sang songs that held coded messages, and created bonds that plantation owners could never fully sever. Spirituals like Follow the Drinking Gourd were more than music, they were maps guiding runaways north. Stories of tricksters like Brer Rabbit gave hope, teaching that the weak could outwit the strong. In these ways, enslaved communities preserved their humanity. They reminded each other that they were more than property, more than numbers in a ledger. They were mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, people who loved and dreamed, even when the system tried to crush those dreams. Rebellion sometimes burst into the open. In the 1830s, Nat Turner's rebellion sent shockwaves through the South as enslaved men rose up and struck against their masters. Though Turner's revolt was brutally suppressed, it revealed the deep rage simmering beneath the surface. For those trapped in breeding farms, even small rebellions, refusing orders, sabotaging tools, feigning illness, became ways to push back. But perhaps the greatest form of resistance was survival itself. To endure, to live through unimaginable pain, and to continue loving despite the risk, that was defiance. Mothers who sang lullabies to children they feared losing were resisting. Fathers who whispered their names into the ears of their newborns, even knowing they might never see them again, were resisting. Every act of love in a system built on hate was a rebellion in its own right. Survivors carried these memories with them into freedom. When emancipation came, many freed people began searching desperately for lost relatives. They posted ads in newspapers, walked miles from town to town, asking strangers if they had seen their sons, daughters, husbands, or wives. Though most never found them again, the act of searching itself was a declaration. The family bond slavery tried to destroy still mattered. They could not be erased. The strength of enslaved people lay not only in the revolts and escapes, but in their refusal to let the system define them. They turned secret remedies into tools of resistance, spirituals into roadmaps, memory into a weapon against erasure. The breeding farms tried to strip them of choice, but even within that darkness, they carved out slivers of defiance. It is important to remember that resistance was not always loud, not always visible. It was in the whispered prayer of a mother, the silent refusal of a man, the tears that carried a child's name into the night. Survival itself was resistance. Through every forced pregnancy, every sale, every separation, enslaved people resisted simply by remaining human, by holding on to their families, their culture, and their love, no matter how hard the system tried to break them. And for every moment of silence, there were whispers. Whispers that carried through generations. Whispers that told the truth about what was endured and how people fought to remain whole, even when their world was torn apart. The breeding farms of the South were never officially acknowledged. No proud plantation brochures announced them. No laws were written that openly declared their existence. Instead, they thrived in the shadows, hidden in plain sight, whispered about, denied by those who profited from them, and recorded only in fragments that survive to this day. Among the enslaved, the truth was spoken quietly, passed down in stories and warnings. Mothers told daughters to guard themselves. Fathers whispered to sons about what might be demanded of them. These conversations lived in the cabins, in the fields, in the dark corners where overseers' ears could not reach. But outside those spaces, silence ruled. White Southern society wrapped itself in denial. Planters spoke of natural increase, a phrase meant to sanitize what was happening. They claimed that enslaved families simply grew because of healthy conditions and the benevolence of their masters. This narrative was repeated in newspapers, in speeches, even in political debates, painting slavery not as exploitation, but as a system that supposedly nurtured and cared for its laborers. But the numbers told a different story. After the 1808 ban on the importation of enslaved Africans, the enslaved population in the United States continued to grow at staggering rates. How could this be without deliberate interference? Abolitionists seized on these statistics, arguing that the South was engaged in a cruel system of forced breeding. Pamphlets published in the North painted shocking pictures of so-called stud farms. Writers described enslaved men, forced to impregnate dozens of women, children born only to be sold, and mothers stripped of choice. These accounts spread fear and outrage, especially in Britain, where abolitionist campaigns were already gaining ground. Yet Southern defenders dismissed these accusations as lies, branding them as abolitionist propaganda. They insisted that breeding farms were a myth designed to tarnish the reputation of the South. Politicians thundered from podiums that their society was built on honor and tradition, not on cruelty. But behind closed doors, the whispers persisted. Travelers from the north sometimes wrote of the strange imbalance they noticed in southern states, how some plantations seemed to have unusually large numbers of children, or how auction blocks overflowed with young enslaved people. Their letters and diaries hinted at what southern society refused to name. Even within the South, not all whites were blind. Some poor farmers with no stake in the slave trade spoke quietly of what they saw. A handful of ministers condemned the practice from the pulpit, though many more looked away, unwilling to confront the powerful planters who filled their pews. The enslaved, of course, needed no convincing. They lived the truth every day. They knew the pain of children sold away, the shame of forced breeding, the silence that smothered their cries. Their testimonies, recorded decades later in WPA interviews, confirmed what abolitionists had long suspected: breeding was not myth. It was reality. But in the antebellum South, open acknowledgement was rare. To admit the existence of breeding farms was to admit that slavery was not just labor, it was the systematic violation of the most intimate human bonds. And such an admission threatened to unravel the moral defenses of the entire institution. So the South clung to its denials. Planters spoke proudly of their children, their plantations, their prosperity, while ignoring the other children, the other families, created in the shadows. Slave traders counted their profits, masking their cruelty with the language of commerce. Newspapers reported on auctions with detached precision, listing the ages, weights, and prices of human beings without once acknowledging the suffering behind those numbers. After the Civil War, the silence deepened. Many former slaveholders wanted the past buried, their reputations cleansed. They rewrote history, painting slavery as a system of paternalism rather than brutality. They spoke of loyalty between masters and slaves, of happy plantations where families were well cared for. In this version of history, there was no place for breeding farms. The formerly enslaved, meanwhile, often carried their stories quietly. The pain was too raw, the memories too sharp. Some spoke, giving testimony that now forms the backbone of our knowledge. Others chose silence, not because they forgot, but because remembering was too heavy a burden to bear. In some families, the truth passed down only in fragments. An old story, a whispered rumor, a name that no one explained. This culture of denial had consequences. For generations, the reality of slave breeding was hidden in plain sight, unspoken in classrooms, absent from history books, dismissed as exaggeration or myth. Only in recent decades has the evidence, through oral histories, economic records, and demographic studies, forced historians to confront the scale of what happened. The breeding farms of the South thrived on secrecy. They depended on denial from the powerful, on whispers among the powerless, and on the silence of history itself. And in that silence, countless families disappeared from the record, erased as though they had never lived at all. But silence cannot erase truth forever. The rumors, the fragments, the testimonies, they survived, and together they paint a picture of a system too cruel to be spoken of openly, but too real to be forgotten. Freedom came suddenly, announced not with celebration everywhere, but with confusion, fear, and uncertainty. In 1865, the chains were legally broken, but the scars of slavery and of the breeding farms did not vanish. For the men, women, and children who had been reduced to property, freedom was both a promise and a question. What happens now? For those who had endured the nightmare of forced breeding, the war's end did not erase their memories. The women who had been compelled to bear children against their will still carried that pain. The men who had been forced to impregnate women under the watchful eyes of overseers struggled with shame and silence. Families torn apart by sales and auctions began desperately searching for one another. Across the South, freedmen placed newspaper ads with heartbreaking pleas. Searching for my wife and child, sold in Richmond in 1858. Looking for my daughter. Last seen on a plantation near Natchez. Some reunited after years of separation. Many never did. The breeding system had scattered bloodlines so thoroughly that countless families were permanently lost. But even in freedom, the shadow of that system lingered. Southern whites, unwilling to face the full horror of what they had done, rewrote the story. They spoke of slavery as a time of order, of happy laborers and strong families. They denied the existence of breeding farms, dismissing survivors' testimony as exaggeration or invention. This rewriting became the cornerstone of the lost cause myth, a narrative that sought to cleanse slavery of its deepest sins. Meanwhile, freedmen and women bore the burden of silence. Some spoke out in church meetings or during Reconstruction hearings, telling officials of the abuses they had suffered. Others carried their stories quietly, ashamed to reveal the intimate details of what had been forced upon them. Many children born from these unions grew up never knowing the truth of their parentage, the circumstances of their conception locked away in family secrets. Economically, the legacy of breeding farms also endured. The children produced through forced reproduction had been capital wealth for their enslavers. When emancipation came, planters lost that wealth. But the system that treated black bodies as a resource did not disappear. Instead, it morphed into new forms: sharecropping, convict leasing, and racial terror, all designed to maintain control over the same population. The logic of exploitation, rooted in slavery, continued in different clothes. The shame of breeding left scars in personal lives too. Generations struggled with fractured family trees, missing branches, and unanswered questions. For some, the gaps became unbearable. In the early 20th century, black genealogists and family historians began tracing lost relatives, piecing together what slavery had stolen. Yet for many, the trail ended in silence, erased by bills of sale and vanished records. The larger American society also lived in denial. School books written in the late 1800s and early 1900s spoke of slavery in vague terms, often portraying it as a benign or even civilizing institution. They rarely mentioned sexual violence. They never spoke of breeding farms. By erasing this history, America allowed generations to grow up ignorant of the trauma carried by millions of black families. But the truth lingered in whispers and stories passed down. Grandmothers spoke of children taken away. Old men told of mothers who had been forced to bear child after child. The WPA slave narratives collected in the 1930s brought some of these memories to light. Survivors, now elderly, told interviewers what they had once been too afraid to say: that breeding was real and that it had shaped their lives. Even today, the shadow stretches forward. Many African Americans researching their ancestry discover broken lines, unexplained names, or sudden disappearances in the 19th century. Some find DNA connections that reveal hidden histories: white ancestors who were never acknowledged, children born of coercion and violence. The breeding farms of the South may be gone, but their legacy is written into bloodlines that still exist, and the silence continues to break. Historians have uncovered records, traced patterns in population growth, and analyzed testimony that confirms what once was dismissed as rumor. What Southern planters tried to bury has resurfaced, undeniable. The breeding farms were not myths. They were a system, planned, organized, and devastating, that shaped the African American experience for generations. After emancipation, the freedmen and women carried these shadows into their new lives. They built churches, schools, and communities. They fought for their rights in a hostile nation. They struggled under Jim Crow laws, racial terror, and systemic injustice. Yet through it all, they carried the unspoken weight of what slavery had done to their families. Some chose to forget. Others chose to remember. But none could truly escape the past. The Civil War ended slavery. But the breeding farms of the South left a legacy of trauma that stretched far beyond 1865. Their impact was not confined to the plantations where they once stood. It lived on in broken families, in silenced voices, and in the very fabric of American society. And so the story does not end with emancipation. It continues in bloodlines, in memories, in history itself, reminding us that freedom cannot erase what was forced in silence, nor heal wounds that remain unspoken. The story of the slave breeding farms is not just a story of the past. It is a wound, deep, raw, and unhealed, that still bleeds into the present. To speak of it is to look unflinchingly into one of the darkest corners of American history. where human lives were not just enslaved, but deliberately multiplied for profit, like livestock. The legacy of this system is not measured only in the millions of people enslaved, but in the generations broken, in the families never reunited, and in the silence that followed. When we trace the threads of history, we find that the forced breeding of enslaved people was not an isolated cruelty. It was part of a larger structure, an economy, a culture, and a nation built upon the denial of black humanity. The breeding farms remind us that slavery was not only about work in the fields or the chains on wrists. It was about control over the most intimate aspects of life, over birth, over family, over love itself. In the Old South, even the act of bringing a child into the world was twisted into an economic calculation. The cradle became an auction block. Motherhood was transformed into a market. Fatherhood was erased, stolen by bills of sale and ledgers. This system did not simply vanish with emancipation. Its echoes carried into Reconstruction, into Jim Crow, into the prisons and labor camps of the 20th century. The same logic, that black bodies could be exploited, controlled, and profited from, continued in new forms. To understand modern inequalities, we must understand that they are not random. They are rooted in this history. But the legacy is not only in oppression, it is also in survival. Enslaved people resisted, in small ways and large. They told stories. They sang songs. They prayed and dreamed of freedom. They held on to scraps of family when the system tried to tear them apart. And even when forced to bear children under conditions of violence, many women still found ways to nurture love, to pass down hope, to teach their children dignity in a world that denied it. That survival is itself a legacy. It is why descendants of the enslaved live today, carrying forward culture, resilience, and strength. Yet the breeding farms remain a painful silence in many family histories. For some, DNA tests reveal unexpected truths. White ancestors whose names were never spoken. Children born of coercion whose descendants live unaware of their origins. For others, the gaps in family trees are too deep to fill. The archive has holes where the truth should be, and America has often chosen silence. For generations, textbooks skipped this story. Museums glossed over it. Politicians avoided it. Even today, the topic is uncomfortable, often reduced to whispers or relegated to footnotes. But silence is not neutrality. It is complicity. By not telling these stories, society allows the pain of the past to remain buried, leaving descendants to carry the weight alone. This is why remembrance matters. To speak of the breeding farms is not to dwell on tragedy for its own sake. It is to honor the victims, to acknowledge their suffering, and to refuse the erasure of their humanity. It is to say, you were not just property, you were not just numbers on a ledger. You were human beings, and your stories matter. The darkest legacy of the Old South is not simply the existence of slave-breeding farms. It is the fact that, for so long, the nation tried to forget them. Yet forgetting does not erase history. It only ensures that its wounds remain unhealed. As we close this story, we must recognize what remembering demands of us. It demands that we face the truth without flinching, even when it is painful. It demands that we see the connections between past and present, between forced breeding and today's inequalities. And it demands that we give voice to those who were silenced. The breeding farms of the South are a reminder of how far human cruelty can go when profit is placed above humanity. But they are also a reminder of the resilience of those who endured. Their survival is not just history, it is legacy. It is a call to us, the living, to ensure that the darkest secrets of the Old South are never hidden again. Because history, when told truthfully, is not just about the past. It is about the present. It is about the future. It is about making sure that such horrors are not repeated, and that the humanity of every person is recognized, honored, and protected. This was the darkest secret of the Old South, and it must never be forgotten.